All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Counseling Black Women Present Brown Table Talks. And today we're going to be talking about self-love and Black women. That since our forced arrival here in the US, Black women have been defined by others. We have been told who we are, and what our value is. Through our history of being told who we are, we've been told that we're not good enough, we're not intelligent enough, we're not beautiful enough. The spirit and the soul, however, of Black women has always survived. Whether it's been in silence or in secrecy, or out loud and proud, when Black women show up, our worth shows up. Today, I'm honored to be in the company of Black women who love themselves and are committed to supporting other Black women in rediscovering self-love. I'm joined by co-editors and several authors of a handbook on counseling African American women. I'm Dr. Kimber Shelton, one of the co-editors and authors of the book. I'm joined today with Dr. Michelle Lynn, who is also a co-editor and author of the handbook and is the director of Oglethorpe University's Counseling Center. Dr. Mahalet Indala, who is also a co-editor and chapter author of the book, and she is the owner of Crossroads Mental Health Services in Georgia. Dr. Ayanna Abrams, she's a licensed psychologist in Georgia, and she's owner of Ascensions Behavioral Health, a co-author of the text. Dr. Tisley Menely, she's a licensed marriage and family therapist and coach in Dallas, and she is the owner of New Day Service Counseling Services and co-author of a book in the text. And then we have a special guest here today, Dr. Dominique Brouchard. She's a licensed psychologist in California, and she's also the co-host of Cultivating Her Space podcast that she shares with Terry Lomax. So thanks everyone for being here and welcome. So in telling our stories, it's important that we get to author our stories. So we're going to be using the work of several Black writers and authors and setting up our discussion today. Toni Morrison, she says, "You are your best thing." So the first question I have for all of us to consider is, what is self-love and where does it come from?
We should have had some numbers or something. I'll start. I think there's so much going around about self-care, self-love, those kinds of things on social media and research. There's a lot out there about it. I think it's one of those things that people have to conceptualize for themselves. For me, I feel like self-love is how you value yourself, right? So when I think about what is my self-love, is how am I showing value to myself? How am I showing that I am valuable, even if I'm showing that to the world in a variety of ways? I think self-love comes from what you see modeled around you. A lot of times, right, our sense of self-love can come from other women in our lives that we've grown up with, and what we see them do, how we see them act, the things that we see them talk about. When it comes to things like hair, right, and dress, those kinds of things, it often comes from those experiences that we've had with other people that we either care about or value in some way. And I think it's a lot about what you learn as you move through life. If I think about what my self-love may have looked like when I was, in my teens compared to my 20s and 30s, and how it's morphing as a woman in her 40s. I can definitely see some transitions in that. And that sense of the way that I have valued myself has definitely changed and developed along the way with different sorts of life experiences. So all about the way I value myself and show that value to others.
I think there is a piece of, in terms of thinking about where it comes from, it has to start with a fundamental understanding that you were born with value and worth, that it isn't determined on what you produce, what you give, what you build, but it's an innate state of being that you start with. And you can do things and you can have experiences and contribute to others' lives as a way of growing and building meaning and experience in your life, but it's not determined by the things you do or what you're able to give others or things like that.
Yeah, I think a quote that, oh, go ahead, Ayana.
Go on, right.
I was going to say a quote that came up for me was, "I am enough." And I've seen Tracy Ellis Ross say that multiple times. But just this understanding that how I show up in every space, I am enough. And I'm going to constantly be evolving, and pouring into myself allows me that opportunity to love on myself. And what that also looks like is like the small day-to-day things that I might do. So making sure that I'm getting enough sleep, making sure that I'm staying hydrated and eating right. Like those are the things that allow me to love myself.
Yeah, I was going to share after Dr. Andala spoke about a a kind of knowing, right, that you have and kind of offer to yourself. But then I also think about self-love as a practice, right? That even when you get away from that, right, what are ways in which you come back to yourself in some of those daily practices, right? This kind of, permission and allowance to continue to come back to yourself and trust yourself. This kind of kind of intimacy and vulnerability that you allow yourself to have, for me, are all of the practices of self-love are also rooted in that, right? And honoring that there might be some days or some moments or some experiences where it might feel hard, right, to love in that way, but that trust that says that I can love and I'm the resource for that. So kind of just that that honoring yourself as your home base, kind of as your greatest resource, I think are the main acts of self-love. Because I recognize that this is hard for a lot of people to grasp, and they're always asking like, yeah, I love myself, but how? It's the how that people get to, like, oh, that sounds good, but how do I value? How do I remember this? How do I show people? So I think it's a mix of both, right? Having that knowing and having that grounding, but having those practices that pull you back to yourself every time.
And thinking about the where does it come from piece, it was interesting even in preparing for today, the relational aspects of it. I happened to have tea this morning with my mother, and I was like, Mom, let me throw these prompts at you. And it was just interesting, just the dynamic that I realized that the self part really does have a lot to do with strong and affirming relationships, particularly with other Black women, and how, how that self-love does come from that modeling piece.
Thank you all for those comments and for those answers. This idea that self-love is something that is internal within us, that we exist, therefore we are loved. We exist, therefore we are worthy. And it's not the things that we are doing or what we're producing or how we're behaving that defines us, our worthiness, or our love. We are here, therefore we are worthy of loving ourselves, and for others, love as well. And I also appreciate hearing the relational piece of it, that modeling that we are relational beings, that it's not true or it's not realistic that self-love is just, it's all going to come from inside, or self-esteem is all about you. No, it is in relations to others. And when we have people who see our worth and honor our worth, that makes it easier for us to accept and breathe in our worthiness. And then I also have really appreciated hearing these comments too, that our self-love is fluid, that it looks different, it changes contextually. The way we loved ourselves in our 20s is different from the way that many of us might be loving ourselves in our 40s and 50s, and to be okay with that fluidity too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Michelle, I would love to hear like maybe your main takeaway from your conversation with your mom.
It was interesting. It definitely was a reflection of her generation. She talked about, Black women as a group being leaders in the civil rights movement, unsung heroes, and the different ways that we've contributed, and how important it is to know your history. So as you are defining yourself and becoming more aware of what you bring and your worth, knowing who you come from, and the long line of Black women who have contributed so much just by who they are, not necessarily all in accomplishments, but just being a part of a community and what they bring. So that was interesting, just sort of that historical piece and knowing your history and how important that was. That was definitely a takeaway.
Well, that's a great segue to the next ideas of Oprah Winfrey. She says, self-esteem means knowing you are the dream. So connected to what you're saying, Michelle, what does it mean for Black women to love themselves?
These are all such big questions. There's, and I don't know if it's more of my my CBT brain that comes back to the practice, right, of things that what does it mean or what does it look like for us to love ourselves? I truly believe that Black women loving ourselves cannot be isolated from loving each other and being in community and being in space and safe community and safe space with each other. To have those reflections, to have those models, to have the accountability, right? Because sometimes when it's hard, right, to have that love, when it's hard to like ourselves, even sometimes, right, to be able to have these reflections outside of ourselves to remind us of that, to remind us of our dreams and that we are the dreams, right? I think that none of that can happen in the isolation. I think some of that happens in the quiet that we spend with ourselves, and in creating the safety of that. So I think of that kind of love, Black women loving themselves as that kind of practice. I think it's much harder for us to access that when we are isolated, when we are feuding, when we feel disconnection, when we miss connections with others. So I think that even across, I imagine all of our work, we are working with people and clients and communities that are finding it hard to access that. And that's usually because there's some disconnection or there's some isolation.
Yeah, I love that. And thinking about that, how that disconnection can be just so a byproduct of the rejection of, of us as being beautiful, as being intelligent, and negative stereotypes. And so all of those having to counteract and fight through those messages constantly, so that we do love ourselves. And I definitely agree with you that having connections with other Black women helps us like pull away from those negative images and more centered on like the realities of what we bring. So I was just thinking about that as you were speaking, Ayana.
Yeah, my thoughts were very similar, that for Black women, a lot of loving ourselves is really about still being able to recognize the value they have among all these things around us that try to tell us that we have no value, and just sort of pushing through so many of those messages, about different parts of ourselves, and still being able to come through that, those daily experiences saying, no, I do have value. And similar to, the previous comment from Mahalet, like regardless of whether I've, authored a chapter, or regardless of whether I've opened a practice, or regardless of whether I have this title or done this job or had this child or married this person, like regardless of all of those things, I just have this inherent value that makes the world a better place, right? Just my presence here is valuable to me, and it's valuable to others.
Yeah, I'm drawn back to previous comments about being able to recognize our truth. And a part of our truth is that we exist in a world that tells us that we are not worthy and that we are not enough and we're not beautiful and we are not capable of being loved or loving. So recognizing that and then continuing to counter that with we are beautiful, we are joyful, we are resilient. All these ways that Black women are eroticized and exoticized and pathologized, knowing those things and understanding what they are as a means of wanting us to not love ourselves or to feed into ourselves and to internalize that hatred and recognizing that, resisting that, and still coming out fully. I was reading an article today about Lizzo and that she had an outfit with her butt cheeks out. Like, I'm showing up, all of me. I'm going to love me regardless of what you say about the way that I look, my appearance, my weight. And then on another day, I can show up and play a flute, fully clothed, and I'm still me, I'm still loving me. So recognizing those messages that say we're not enough and we're not worthy, rejecting those things and still standing in our truth and our beauty.
And a part of that act of self-love is making sure that you have enough space to connect with your true self. You know, I think as it was mentioned before, this changes across time and space depending on circumstances and everything you're navigating in life. And if you are not creating the opportunities to kind of sit, kind of connect with self, hear yourself, hear kind of what your mind and body is telling you in terms of things that you're needing, it can be hard. It's very easy to get disconnected from self because of all this noise that exists that tries to counter that.
And I think it also comes back to that community, right, that we have within each other. Like I think about, Kimber, what you mentioned about Lizzo and thinking about how many other Black women are like saluting her and applauding her. And also how many little Black girls are seeing that and now saying to themselves, like what they're internalizing is no matter what I look like, I'm worthy of love. And so being able to see those messages around us, I think is incredibly important. And to have that space where even if it's one other Black woman who just sees you and just the feeling that you get when you are seen, it's so important.
Now, I could even connect this professionally. I don't know what each of your experiences have been like, but going to predominantly white universities and having predominantly white supervisors and faculty. And then at one point, I was just surrounded by Black women psychologists, one of them being Michelle Lynn. And it was just such a different experience that I was getting great guidance and mentorship, but there's just something qualitatively that's different when you're in the presence of Black women and they are your role models and they are your supporters. It just feels different. That community just feels different. The way I appreciate myself, even as a psychologist, felt different being in the presence of other Black women professionals. And we're sitting here speaking about self-love, and I don't think we want to give the impression that we have arrived. This is self-love, but there is this fluid process with it too. And that loving ourselves is not always easy and it can be challenging. Audre Lorde, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So for me, I know that much of my self-love is rooted in my relationship with my mother. That I know, regardless of what I do, who I am, how much money I earn, what my relationships look like, there's nothing that I can do or cannot do where my mother would not love me. And I know as a helping professional, that's not everyone's experience. They don't have that foundation where you just know you're lovable because someone has always showed you and demonstrated that you are lovable and that you are worthy. So what for Black women are some of the challenges we might face in being able to love ourselves?
I think it speaks to what you just mentioned in knowing that there are other people around you who see you, who feel you, who acknowledge that you are worthy and that you are lovable. And what I've seen is that sometimes it's something that's happening within ourselves that we don't see it, right? Sometimes we might be dealing with depression. Sometimes there might be other traumas that we're experiencing that are preventing us from recognizing that the people around us really do love us, really do care for us, really are showing up for us, but we're in a space where we're unable to see it or unable to receive it. And I think that's part of our role as therapists is helping folks get to that space where they are able to see it.
Thanks for that. And maybe we can even hear more about that. That sometimes it's not just we don't love ourselves, it may be depression that's making it really hard for us to love ourselves. It's our history of trauma that's making it really challenging for us to love ourselves.
I was thinking about the opposite experience, Kimber, that you described of having that mother and that unconditional positive regard, which I can relate to as well in my relationship with my mother. But like you said, not everyone has that. So for young Black girls or Black women in particular, finding other ways or having other ways, whether that's through a therapist connection, a teacher who takes interest in them, someone in the community. You know, I've heard lots of stories, some fictional, some biographical accounts of that one Black teacher in the school that made an effort or showed an interest in particular students, and how that was foundational for the rest of that person's life. And those people have gone on to do big things and credit, sort of that experience of connecting with that teacher. So just, even being as mental health professionals, we're privileged, right, to be in that role directly, but there sure are ways indirectly that we can have that same type of influence or influence our clients once they've had that experience, how they can share that, how they can get involved, and instilling that type of presence in other Black women or young Black girls.
And the conversation that we're having is about a modeling when we think about, young Black girls, right? When we think about young Black children, we think about teenage Black girls, and historically, politically, socially, the ways in which Black women have had to prioritize, survival over these acts of love, right, have really gotten in the way, right, of this kind of modeling, right, and it turned into, right, depressive symptoms and trauma and anxiety symptoms, all these things that are these fogs, right, that really stifle, right, what love can look like, even while those survival strategies have been acts of love, right? Those are different acts of love, right? They come with a lot of other things, right? So it makes sense that I don't know what everybody, like our generation, right, and clients who we work with don't have a lot of models for that. And therefore, maybe when models do show up, being really, really hard to recognize, having a mistrust, right? That when a teacher shows up, right, in a way that we might recognize, right, as an act or a presence of love, there is a mistrust, there's a skepticism, there's a I don't need that, right, because of what we have been taught over time. And I think that goes into, or is also connected to, not having a lot of skills and models in the vulnerability and the intimacy that it requires, right, to engage in love for yourself, but also to recognize love, to recognize it as love enough to receive it enough, to know it enough to give it, right? There are all these different layers and trajectories of that. And if we don't have the safety enough to engage in the intimacy and have a practice of it and kind of have it be more fluid for us and in our communities, it's going to be hard to really replicate that. Or what we've seen is that it is hard, right, to replicate that.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a conversation I had earlier this week with a white man, and we were talking about race and ethnicity and how it shows up in professional spaces. And one of the things that he asked me was, how do you prepare your children for what they're going to potentially experience? And I was thinking, how do you prepare your children so that my children then don't have to experience these things? But I think that that's a part of what some of you have been noting, that there's this duality of that survival of, I can't send you out into this world unprepared, and then also creating that space for, and you are enough. They're going to say these things about you, and you are enough. They're going to try to tell you this is who you are, and you are worthy. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work for us instilling in someone else. That's a lot of work for us to have to internalize ourselves. And again, that journey is not always easy. And even looking around the room, that there's different complexions, there's different hairstyles, or different textures, and that we're talking about being in community with other Black women and how much of a strength that is. But sometimes being in community with other Black women, we don't always feel supported. So I'm just curious for each of you, how have things like colorism and texturism or physical appearance and body size and weight, how has that impacted your self-love?
Yeah, it's interesting that the talk about vulnerability and self-love. Like for me, being vulnerable enough to admit that I'm struggling in one of those areas, that, I may be, a psychologist or whatever, but I'm not immune to, having these kind of issues, comparing myself to, XYZ person, or, a standard that I feel, I should be reaching or striving for in my appearance, and that's just not a reality for me for whatever reason, and sitting with that, slowing down and saying, wow, okay, I feel some type of way about that, and then moving beyond that to say, well, that's part of me. How I look is part of who I am, but there's all these other aspects of me, and that those different aspects of me also deserve as much time and effort, who I am as a person, and my strengths. And so shifting, I think, the focus from the physical, but certainly I have struggled with all of the above, the size, colorism, and different comments about hair texture and comparisons to other family members, coming from like most of us as African Americans or Black women come from diverse families, and so there's lots of differences, and sometimes family members make comments, and those things haven't impacted me personally, and just really trying to learn, well, what is it about me that's unique and different? Who is Michelle? And learning to love those things and identify those things. But it's an ongoing process, ongoing.
I think there's a piece of exhaustion and also partially wisdom from age that comes from a certain level of, I think Cicely mentioned earlier, it looks different in your 20s versus 30s versus 40s. I remember just teens into 20s, it's, well, here's all these narratives and all these images of what we're supposed to look like, or what's acceptable, or what's considered beautiful, and working to try to, what is my version of that? And is there a way that I can fit into that? And getting to a point of realizing, is this worth it? Is this worth it? Right? And things like perming my hair, stopping perming, when I decided this is what are the implications of this? Why am I doing this? What is the purpose? And my time is valuable, and there's so many other things, my energy, my money, there's so many other things that I could be utilizing these resources for. And I think there's a point where I had to reach a certain point of age of just saying, being able to witness also how standards of beauty shift over time. It's like, oh, wait, this is not a static thing, which then helps me see just how fickle it is, right? And kind of, again, what are the implications of me trying to keep up with something that's ever changing? That released me in some way to say, let's see what you're naturally like. Let's take all that stuff off. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And being able to allow myself to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, age and wisdom are a benefit. In a lot of ways, I think, our professions are a benefit as well, because, now I'm at a place where when I get irritated about my gray hairs, I can actually like stop and ask myself, okay, why is that an issue for you, right? And understanding that, certain signs of aging are an issue because society tells us certain things about women and aging, right? And so I'm able to put those things into a particular context because of my sort of academic understanding of, these social biases. So I think having those different lenses in many ways helps with making some of these transitions and finding ways to continue to be accepting and continue to be loving of myself despite like all the differences my body has gone through right after having a kid and metabolism changing and gray hairs and all the different things that shift over time for us. Um, just sort of having that different lens of, for some, experience or these other parts of our lives that help to add context for us, and being able to just have that self-awareness. Okay, this is why I'm having such a reaction, and this is how I'm going to deal with that so that I can continue to be as accepting as possible of who I am and how I show up.
I want to share just a small kind of little example of that, of just life circumstances and their shift and how they help with that self-acceptance. After I had my son, during breastfeeding, one of the things I noticed he would do is I would hold him, he's nursing, and then his hand would always naturally reach to my stomach and just find the soft spots on my stomach and kind of sit there and just, while he's nursing, he just squishes, right? And it was something that had the potential to be something I struggled with my body. It became just a beautiful, poignant thing. He is now 6.5. And if he's ever sick, if he's ever kind of had a nightmare, if he comes and kind of, if I'm holding him, his hands finally naturally find those soft spots that are still there that never went away. And just, he just squishes, and that's kind of his safety blanket. And it's just so meaningful to me that I love it. I embrace it. And that it's there, that it gives comfort. It's a piece of me loving something that sometimes, that could be a problem for some people.
Yeah, thanks.
I love that.
Yeah. I think about the generational things too, in terms of loving selves. I think about my nieces who are in their 20s, and like they just don't ever have clothes on. And my mother is like, put some clothes on. But I'm like, man, the way my body looked in my 20s, I should have just been naked all the time. No, like embrace that. And you can't be responsible for what somebody thinks of you because of how you're dressing. You feel good about your body, and to be okay with that. So I appreciate this younger generation where they are least visibly, being much more connected to and appreciative of their bodies in whatever the size or whatever the shape it is. And then we've been talking about how hair and complexion and body impacts our self-love. Also thinking about Black women, we are magical, we are unicorns, we are super, we are strong. All these adjectives that are used to describe Black women. Do all Black women fit into that? Are there just regular Black women who are not the strong Black woman, or who doesn't want to be magical, and who it's just okay just kind of being under the radar? Is that possible, and how might that impact self-love? That before we got on, Ayana and I were talking and following each other on social media, I just see Ayana everywhere. So it'd be very easy to be like, oh, look what she's doing in comparison to what I'm doing. So how do we deal with professionally what we as Black women are supposed to be, or how we're supposed to represent, and how does that impact our love of self?
Now, if y'all were in therapy sessions, you would see how difficult it is for me that even though I'm doing all this stuff out there, that doesn't match the internal message. You would hear my therapist talk about all the imposter stuff and like, I wish you would sit down. So it is the right, but you talk about the comparisons of what you see, and then how you kind of internalize all these messages kind of based on all this information we have of us, connected to these things. And it makes me, think about the different friendships that I have, and the different, professional relationships with Black women, the different friendships and professional relationships that I have with Black women, and how we are oftentimes talking about these things, not only, comparisons and support and accountability amongst ourselves, but, ways in which, there were times in which I used to take in and maybe have a bit of a badge or pride about being able to do so much. And yes, I'm resilient. Yes, we've come through the fire. Yes, I've had to deal with this or this or this. And I'm the daughter of Caribbean immigrants, and oh my goodness, right? I can do all these things and it's still not enough because I'm not a surgeon, and right, so it's never, and I'm the wrong kind of doctor. And what I noticed for myself and for some of my closer peers or friends, that more recently, we have more actively rejected, like, resilient, I don't want that. I don't want that to be how you describe me. I don't want you to describe me as strong. I don't want to be magical. Like, I don't want to be superwoman. I think depending on who I hear it from, and if it's in safe community, I can hold that, internalize that, and it feels really good and warm, and I feel seen. But where I tend to hear it is not always from us. And those are the moments where I reject it. I do not take in narratives from, or I don't hold on to or look for narratives from white people calling me resilient or strong, or kind of those things that they might see as like accolades, when oftentimes it's connected to strife or strain and look at all you've been through. And I think some of that also happens within the community. Oftentimes when people are describing Black women who they love, they describe us in relation to all the hardships that either we've experienced or that even they have put us through. She dealt with, I did this and I did this, and this, like, it's not a compliment, right? So I think that there is some fluidity that I am seeing and experiencing and noticing in how Black women are responding to this language. So I think it is very nuanced and very personal when we see that as a compliment versus when we see that as more labor for us. And I'm moving more towards the side where I tend to see it as more labor, and I don't always find those things as compliments, but it also depends on who's saying it to me and where I'm reading it, or kind of what's the context of
it. I appreciate you pointing that out, because I think of, like, as you were talking, I was thinking of spaces that I've been in where I've been the only Black person in that space. And there's a lot of stress and there's a lot of emotional labor on my part. And I'm being told, oh, you're so resilient. And Well, yeah, because you're inflicting harm on me. So I have no choice but to be in this space. But then I also think about how I go back to that loving myself and recognizing that I am enough, and me at my bare minimum. The way I tend to view it is me at my bare minimum automatically puts me in a space where I'm showing up 1,000 times better than the other people in that space anyway. And so then that's what makes me magical. It's not that I'm necessarily doing anything extra, it's me showing up as I am is more than enough. And I find myself having to kind of say that and having to remind myself that your mere presence is an added bonus for any of those spaces that you're in where you're not around all Black people.
Just taking all of that in. I'm fresh off of a work trip that I was on for the past 4 days with some colleagues who we're in different departments and different roles, and but what we are on this shared committee together, and we had to go do some training for the committee, and happened to be all Black women, and just the process of just all of the things that happened on this work trip. In the end, it did not feel like work, and that was amazing to me. But I think it stemmed from the things that we're talking about now. It's just the shared experiences, and the ways that we may struggle in our different roles at different times, and but having the opportunity to debrief that, and sometimes not even getting into details, but just recognizing, wow, here we are on this work trip, and it's 3 Black women. How amazing that is, not to be the only one, or to have to explain this or that, and just that experience. But I just really have been reflecting on that as we're sitting here having this conversation, and not all of us have had the same kind of experience of like where we wanted to go, and it didn't have to be magical. It was just being enough and being there, and how important that was, just to show up in that space and to be ourselves.
I come from a refugee family. So we came from Ethiopia. I was 4 years old when we left Ethiopia. And one thing I had to kind of dismantle in my mind in adulthood, after having done my own work and things like that, is just what the idea of struggle means. What is actual struggle? Meaning, growing up, with my parents having gone through trauma, and they did a phenomenal job of protecting my sister. And I was 4 again when we left. My sister was 1. So we didn't have kind of direct impact of the original trauma that forced us to leave, Ethiopia. But my parents were dealing with that trauma for many, many, many years post. Never again. Therapy is not a thing, so they kind of just had to figure out how to work through that in kind of their own natural ways. And it took a long time, but one of the messages that got imprinted in our family is just the idea of little things like stressors at school would come up, and the response would be, well, what's the problem? Like, that's not a big deal. Just do it. Why are you upset? Why are you crying about that? Like, essentially, suck it up is the message. Like, and part of the difficulties around that is because they also didn't share with us what happened, and really the full information of what happened, until I was in my 20s. And all we knew is just the message always was suck it up, like, do better, just figure it out, get through it, whatever it is. And I remember having a conversation with my parents once they actually told us the full narrative of kind of what they went through. And my mom stopping and saying, now do you understand why I didn't have the energy for your high school kind of things, and like those little stressors that you're dealing with? And at that time I was like, oh yeah. But it still didn't click. And again, until years later of, no, that's trauma. Like that's not normal everyday stress. Like I shouldn't be comparing trauma to everyday stress and telling myself, suck it up on the day-to-day things that maybe I needed help with, or I needed support around, or validation around, you know. And part of the process now is silencing that voice when I'm dealing with a stress, or I'm telling myself, just suck it up, just push through, just get through it. It's no, that's not healthy. That's not healthy. It's okay to slow down. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to say no. It's okay to ask for help. And kind of, it's an ongoing conversation internally.
Yeah, thanks so much for all those comments. I mean, even for myself, I remember when people would offer me help, I would be offended. What do you mean? Can you help me? No, you can't help me. And then it was that they saw a vulnerability in me, and then my weakness was exposed. So I was just really feeling offended by that. And that we'll see it head nods, those messages of you have to work harder, you always have to show up strong, you can never be weak. Mahalet, as you're describing, that's founded in our trauma, that's founded in intergenerational trauma, because it was true. Like our ancestors, they had to show up 100% all the time. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to be sitting here today if they didn't do those things. So they had to survive. They had to always be on. They had to be magical. But then do we continue that? So when we're seeing other Black women achieving and striving, in our mind is that I'm supposed to be doing those things too, or I need to be doing more. And what's the messages that we send to our children? And I think of that mental and psychological shift of, I recognize why my ancestors had to work so hard, and I'm appreciative of it. Thank you. But y'all did the work already. The work has been done. You paved the way for me to be able to breathe, for me to be able to rest. That idea of rest as resistance. I'm not going to continue that psychological trauma, that pressure on myself, and even the comparison or minimizing other Black women for the sake of survival or being better or being enough, when already we were enough. Our ancestors were enough, but didn't have that space to be able to live their truth. Thank them, you created space for me to live that truth, and being able to walk in that truth and not perpetuate those traumas or those inner critics that are founded in racism and sexism. Okay, so go ahead, Tisley.
Well, I was just going to say, I think a couple of us have kind of touched on it or implied it. And considering the overall topic of our conversation, you know, for me, one of the biggest pieces to this sort of self-love journey has been finding a Black therapist, one that I really connected with, because I've had a couple of Black therapists in the past. But now I have one that I feel like I really have a connection with. She really sort of gets and understands me. And I feel like I have been able to, because of that, you know, that sort of unconditional acceptance and affirmation, really been able to explore some things that I hadn't been able to explore, wasn't willing to explore with other therapists. And so you made the comment earlier about sort of those, the qualitative aspects of the relationships that we have when there are people who are similar to us, that, you know, you can't always put a number on it, but you know that it's meaningful. And I think for so many of us, just having a therapist, but definitely having a therapist who gets certain things that you don't have to explain, right? There doesn't have to be any sort of definitions given for certain, like they just sort of get it and you can move on to the other stuff, is really just so invaluable to this process of self-love, and having someone there who holds you accountable to that self-love as well, that maybe you wouldn't necessarily get with a therapist who has a different background.
Okay, thank you for that. And so mentioning your own exploration through therapy, Ayana, you talked about you were able to take your vulnerabilities into therapy when we're doing these social comparisons. If you are in therapy right now or have been in therapy in the past, raise your hand. Right. We all have to take care of ourselves too, and that we are not immune from these things too. So the last question or idea that I have, Alice Walker, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So for Black women, how can we build our self-love? How can we support our self-love through therapy?
I think this is another way that our ancestors have paved the way. There is still stigma in our community and barriers, but so much less than there have been historically. And I think just to give ourselves permission to to engage in the process of therapy, or even just to find out what it's about. Maybe we've heard this or that, but we haven't had a personal experience. So I think for Black women to at least try it. Think about just the value in having your own experience of something, versus taking everyone else's word for it. Just try it. And, like Cicely said, if it's not a fit, or, if you need to move around until you find a fit, it's okay to do that. But just at least give it a try. Our ancestors have paved the way to give us these opportunities.
I know I keep talking about vulnerability, right? But the vulnerability that allows us to not have to do the hard things by ourselves, right? Which connects to that permission, right? Not only do I have a permission to offering myself permission to learn about myself in this way, but offering myself permission to receive help and guidance and connection. And oftentimes, right, as we know, sometimes these might be the only spaces, right, that Black women have, right? Some of them do have multiple spaces, and therapy becomes a therapeutic relationship becomes one of them. But we know that sometimes this is a Black woman's first stop, right, on her way to herself, right? She doesn't have the other kind of resources externally, whether through Black women, whether through partners, whether through family, whether in work relationships, but allowing yourself the permission and the love that says, I don't have to do all these parts of my life by myself. I get to receive help. That not only is an act of self-love, but it's also a way for me to practice receiving love, right, from someone else. And I think that is oftentimes a hard sell, particularly when there isn't that modeling of love, and how self-love also looks like humility and kind of dropping your guard and things like that. But I think that is part of the practice for Black women as well, to allow help, to allow ourselves to be resourced externally, and that therapy is another part of community for us.
So do it. Go to therapy. It can feel different, possibly, if you're working with a Black therapist, but we know that there's not a plethora of Black therapists out there. That what's most important is that the therapist is culturally competent, and you feel heard, you feel understood, and you feel seen. And you might have to do some shopping around, but therapy is one way that we are able to come into ourselves. And I just really like that comment. It's a stop in coming into your self-love. So just in closing, for some Black women, a defining moment for them might be going to therapy. That's a defining moment in loving oneself. Just want to, real quick, if there's a defining moment that you had that proclaimed your self-love, to hear what that is. I know for me, 8 years ago, when I went natural, that was a proclamation of my self-love.
Yeah, that was mine too. It wasn't 8 years ago, but about 5, 6. No, it's probably been about 6 years ago.
Interestingly, Yeah,
Go
mine
ahead.
was over, it was over 10 years ago. I can't remember how long ago it was, but it was over 10 years ago when I went natural. And that was the start, like the turning point. It became a longer journey, but that was like the start of that journey.
I was going to say the same thing. I did a big chop with clippers and all. And it was probably more like 30 years ago. But that was definitely a defining moment.
January 2007. Yep.
And I would say that me stopping not perming my hair anymore. I really like this example for us to move through was not like actively an act of self-love. Mine was, and maybe it was an act of self-love because I was tired and I was just like, I need something else got to happen here. Like I can't keep, I was tired. I was in graduate school and I didn't have the money to keep up right with hair care. I just moved to a major city. So me now kind of getting twists and braids more and more and more to grow out the perm, I guess maybe was an act of self-love in terms of my tired self and my financial self when I was in school. I think it turned into more love for myself and more honoring of myself and more tapping into more of my creativity and tapping into, I guess, really kind of confronting, body image and self-esteem stuff and things around colorism and texturism. So I don't think that was my active way in. It wasn't this like revolutionary thing towards health or growth, but I think it became that for me, also connected to community, right? With me talking to other people and my sister and other women in the community about hair and love and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it didn't start there with me, but I think that's where it's ended up for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, those are beautiful stories. Thank you all for that, for those defining moments. And thank you all for joining today for Counseling Black Women Present Brown Table Talks, Black Women and Self-Love. So we can't wait to hear the comments and hear about your defining moments in self-love, and appreciate you all for showing up here today.
Thank you for having us.